Chapter 10. Onions and Orchids. The perimeters of similar polygons are as their homologous sides. Patti dreamily assured herself of this important truth for the 20th time, as she sat by the open schoolroom window, her eyes on the billowing whiteness of the cherry tree which had burst into blossom overnight. It was particularly necessary that she should finish her lessons with dispatch, because it was Saturday, and she was going to the city with Mademoiselle's party to spend an hour in the dentist's chair. But the weather was not conducive to concentrated effort. After an hour of half-hearted study, she closed her geometry and started upstairs to dress, leaving the stay-at-homes to another hour of work. She started upstairs, but she did not get very far on the way. As she passed the open door that led to the back porch, she stepped outside to examine the cherry tree at close range. Then she strolled the length of the pergola to see how the wisteria was coming on. From there, it was just a step to the lane, with its double row of pink-tipped apple trees. Before she knew it, Patti found herself sitting on the stone wall at the end of the lower pasture. Behind her lay the confines of St. Ursula's. Before her, the world. She sat on top of the wall and dangled her feet out of bounds. The very most scandalous crime one could commit at St. Ursula's was to go out of bounds without permission. Patti sat and gazed at the forbidden land. She knew that she had no time to waste if she were to catch the hearse and the train and the dentist's chair. But still she sat and dreamed. Finally, far across the fields on the high road, she spied the hearse bowling merrily to the station. Then it occurred to her that she had forgotten to report to Mademoiselle that she was going, and that Mademoiselle, accordingly, would not be missing her. At the school, of course, they would think she had gone, and likewise would not be missing her. Without any premeditated iniquity, she was free. She sat a few moments longer to let the feeling penetrate. Then she slid over the wall and started, a joyous young mutineer seeking adventure. Following the cheery course of the brook, she dipped into a tangled ravine and stretch of woodland, raced down a hillside and across a marshy meadow, leaping gaily from hummock to hummock, occasionally missing and going in. She laughed aloud at these misadventures, and waved her arms and romped with the wind. In addition to the delicious sense of feeling free, was the added delicious sense of feeling bad. The combination was intoxicating. And so, always following the stream, she came at last to another wood. Not a wild wood like the first, but a tame, domesticated wood. The dead limbs were cut away, and the ground was neatly brushed up under the trees. The brook flowed sedately between the fern-bordered banks, under rustic bridges, and widened occasionally into pools carpeted with lily pads. Mossy paths set with stepping-stones led off into mysterious depths that the eye could not penetrate. The leaves were just out enough to half hide and to tantalize. The grass was starred with crocuses. It looked like an enchanted wood in a fairy tale. This second wood, however, was bordered by a solid stone wall, and on top of the wall by 4 strands of barbed wire. Signs appeared at intervals. 3 were visible from where Patti stood, stating that these were private grounds and that trespassers would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Patti knew well to whom it belonged. She had often passed the front gates which faced on that other road. The estate was celebrated in the neighborhood, in the United States, for the matter of that. It comprised 500 acres and belonged to a famous, or infamous, multimillionaire. His name was Silas Weatherby, and he was the originator of a great many wicked corporations. He had beautiful conservatories full of tropical plants, a sunken Italian garden, an art collection and picture gallery. He was a crusty old codger, always engaged in 6 lawsuits. He hated the newspapers, and the newspapers hated him. He was in particularly bad repute at St. Ursula's, because in response to a politely couched note from the principal asking that the art class might view his Botticelli and the botany class his orchids, he had ungraciously replied that he couldn't have a lot of schoolgirls running over his place. If he let them come one year, He would have to let them come another, and he didn't wish to establish a precedent. Patti looked at the no trespassing signs and the barbed wire, and she looked at the wood beyond. They couldn't do anything if they did catch her, she reasoned, except turn her out. People weren't jailed nowadays for taking a peaceable walk in other people's woods. Besides, the millionaire person was attending a directors' meeting in Chicago. This bit of neighborhood gossip she had gleaned that morning in her weekly perusal of the daily press. Saturday night at dinner they were supposed to talk on current topics, so Saturday morning they glanced at the headlines and an editorial. Since the family were not at home, why not drop in and inspect the Italian garden? The servants were doubtless more polite than the master. She selected a portion of the wall where the wire seemed slack and wriggled under, stomach-wise, tearing only a small hole in the shoulder of her blouse. She played with the enchanted wood half an hour or so. Then, following a path, she quite suddenly left the wood behind and popped out into a garden. Not a flower garden, but a kitchen garden on a heroic scale. Neat plots of sprouting vegetables were bordered by currant bushes, and the whole was surrounded by a high brick wall, against which pear trees were trained in the English fashion. A gardener was engaged, with his back toward Patti, in setting out baby onions. She studied him dubiously, divided between a prompting to run and a social instinct of friendliness. He was an extremely picturesque gardener, dressed in knickerbockers and leather gaiters, with a touch of red in his waistcoat, and a cardigan jacket and a cap on the side of his head. He did not look very affable, but he did look rheumatic. Even if he chased her, she was sure that she could run faster than he. So she settled herself on his wheelbarrow and continued to watch him, while she pondered an opening remark. He glanced up suddenly and caught sight of her. The surprise nearly tipped him over. "Good morning," said Patti pleasantly. "Ugh!" grunted the man. "What are you doing here?" "Watching you plant onions." This struck Patti as a self-evident truth, but she was perfectly willing to state it. He grunted again as he straightened his back and took a step toward her. "Where'd you come from?" he demanded gruffly. "Over there." Patti waved her hand largely to westward. "Humph!" he remarked. "You belong to that school? Saint something or other?" She acknowledged it. St. Ursula's monogram was emblazoned large upon her sleeve. "Do they know you're out?" "No," she returned candidly. "I don't believe they do. I am quite sure of it, in fact. They think I've gone to the dentist's with Mamselle, and she thinks I'm at school. So it leaves me entirely at leisure. I thought I'd come over and see what Mr. Weatherby's Italian garden looks like. I'm interested in Italian gardens." "Well, I'll be," he commenced, and came a trifle nearer and stared again. "Did you happen to see any no trespassing signs as you came through?" "Mercy, yes. The whole place is peppered with 'em." "They don't seem to have impressed you much." "Oh, I never pay any attention to no trespassing signs," said Patti easily. "You'd never get anywhere in this world if you let them bother you." The man unexpectedly chuckled. "I don't believe you would," he agreed. "I've never let them bother me," he added meditatively. "Can't I help you plant your onions?" Patti asked politely. It struck her that this might be the quickest route to the Italian garden. "Why, yes, thank you." He accepted her offer with unexpected cordiality, and gravely explained the mode of the work. The onions were very tiny, and they must be set right side up with great care, because it is very difficult for an embryonic onion to turn itself over after it has once got started in the wrong direction. Patti grasped the business very readily, and followed along in the next row 3 feet behind him. It turned out sociable work. By the end of 15 minutes they were quite old friends. The talk ranged far, over philosophy and life and morals. He had a very decided opinion on every subject. She put him down as Scotch. He seemed a well-informed old fellow, though, and he read the papers. Patti had also read the paper that morning. She discoursed at some length upon whether or not corporations should be subject to state control. She stoutly agreed with her editor that they should. He maintained that they were like any other private property, and that it was nobody's damned business how they managed themselves. "A penny, please," said Patti, holding out her hand. "A penny? What for?" "That damn. Every time you use slang or bad grammar, you have to drop a penny in the charity box. Damn is much worse than slang. It's swearing. I ought to charge you 5 cents, but since this is the first offense, I'll let you off with 1. He handed over his penny, and Patti gravely pocketed it. "What sort of things do you learn in that school?" he inquired, with a show of curiosity. She obligingly furnished a sample. "The perimeters of similar polygons are as their homologous sides." "You will find that useful," he commented, with a suggestion of a twinkle in his eye. "Very," she agreed, "on examination day." After half an hour, onion planting grew to be wearying work, but Patti was bound to be game, and stick to her job as long as he did. Finally, however, the last onion was in, and the gardener rose and viewed the neat rows with some satisfaction. "That will do for today," he declared. "We've earned a rest." They sat down, Patti on the wheelbarrow, the man on an upturned tub. "How do you like working for Mr. Weatherby?" she inquired. "Is he as bad as the papers make out?" The gardener chuckled slightly as he lighted his pipe. "Well," he said judiciously, "he's always been very decent to me, but I don't know as his enemies have any cause to love him." "I think he's horrid," said Patti. "Why?" asked the man with a slight air of challenge. He was quite willing to run his master down himself, but he would not permit an outsider to do it. "He's so terribly stingy with his old conservatories. The Dowager, I mean Mrs. Trent, the principal, you know, wrote and asked him to let the botany class see his orchids, and he was just as rude as he could be." "I'm sure he didn't mean it," the man apologized. "Oh, yes, he did," maintained Patti. "He said he couldn't have a lot of schoolgirls running through and breaking down his vines. As if we would do such a thing! We have perfectly beautiful manners. We learn 'em every Thursday night." "Maybe he was a little rude," he agreed. "But you see, he hasn't had your advantages, miss. He didn't learn his manners in a young ladies' boarding school." "He didn't learn them anywhere," Patti shrugged. The gardener took a long pull at his pipe and studied the horizon with narrowed eyes. "It isn't quite fair to judge him the way you would other people," he said slowly. "He's had a good deal of trouble in his life, and now he's old, and I dare say pretty lonely sometimes. All the world's against him. When people are decent, he knows it's because they're after something. Your teacher, now, is polite when she wants to see his conservatories, but I'll bet she believes he's an old thief." "Isn't he?" asked Patti. The man grinned slightly. "He has his moments of honesty, like the rest of us." "Perhaps," Patti grudgingly conceded, "he may not be so bad when you know him. It's often the way. Now, there was Lordy, our Latin teacher. I used to despise her, and then, in the hour of trial, she came up to the scratch and was perfectly bully." He held out his hand. "A penny." Patti handed him back his own. "She kept me from getting expelled. She did, really. I've never been able to hate her since. And you know, I miss it dreadfully. It's sort of fun having an enemy." "I've had a good many," he nodded, "and I've always managed to enjoy them." "And probably they're really quite nice," she suggested. "Oh, yes," he agreed. "The worst criminals are often very pleasant people when you see their right side." "Yes, that's true," said Patti. "It's mainly chance that makes people bad. I know it is in my own case. This morning, for instance, I got up with every intention of learning my geometry and going to the dentist's, and yet here I am. And so," she pointed a moral, "you always ought to be kind to criminals and remember that under different circumstances you might have been in jail yourself." "That thought," he acknowledged, "has often occurred to me. We, that is," he resumed after a moment of amused meditation. "Mr. Weatherby believes in giving a man a chance. If you have any convict friends who are looking for a job, this is the place to send them. We used to have a cattle thief taking care of the cows, and a murderer in charge of the orchids." "What fun!" cried Patti. "Have you got him now? I should love to see a murderer." "He left some time ago. The place was too slow for him." "How long have you been working for Mr. Weatherby?" she asked. "A good many years. And I've worked hard," he added, with a slight air of challenge. "I hope he appreciates you." "Yes, I think on the whole that he does." He knocked the ashes from his pipe and rose. "And now," he suggested, "should you like me to show you the Italian garden?" "Oh, yes," said Patti, "if you think Mr. Weatherby wouldn't mind." "I'm head gardener. I do what I please." "If you're head gardener, what makes you plant onions?" "It's tiresome work. Good for my character." "Oh," Patti laughed. "And then, you see, when I have a tendency to overwork the men under me, I stop and think how my own back ached." "You're much too nice a man to work for him," she pronounced approvingly. "Thank you, miss." He touched his hat with a grin. The Italian garden was a fascinating spot, with marble steps and fountains and clipped yew trees. "Oh, I wish Connie could see it!" Patti cried. "And who is she?" "Connie's my roommate. She's awfully interested in gardens this year, because she's going to get the botany prize for analyzing the most plants. At least I think she's going to get it. It's between her and Karen Hershey. All the rest of the class have dropped out. May Van Arsdale is working against Connie to spite me because I wouldn't stay in an old secret society that she started. She gets orchids from the city and gives them to Karen." He frowned over this tangle of intrigue. "Is it entirely fair for the rest to help?" "Oh, yes," said Patti. "They have to do the analyzing, but their friends can collect and paste. Every time anybody goes for a walk, she comes back with her blouse stuffed full of specimens for either Connie or Karen. The nice girls are for Connie. Karen's an awful dig. She wears eyeglasses and thinks she knows everything." "I'm for Miss Connie myself," he declared. "Is there any way in which I could help?" Patti glanced about tentatively. "You have quite a number of plants," she suggested, "that Connie hasn't got in her book." "You shall take back as many as you can carry," he promised. "We'll pay a visit to the orchid house." They left the garden behind and turned toward the glass roofs of the conservatories. Patti was so entertained that she had entirely forgotten the passage of time until she came face to face with a clock in the gable of the carriage house. Then she suddenly realized that St. Ursula's luncheon had been served 3/4 of an hour before, and that she was in a starving condition. "Oh, goodness gracious, I forgot all about luncheon." "Is it a very grave crime to forget about luncheon?" "Well," said Patti with a sigh, "I sort of miss it." "I might furnish you with enough to sustain life for a short time," he suggested. "Oh, could you?" she asked relievedly. She was accustomed to having a table spread 3 times a day, and she cared little who furnished it. "Just some milk," she said modestly, "and some bread and butter and cookies. Then, you see, I won't have to go back till 4 o'clock when they come from the station, and maybe I can slip in without being missed." "You just wait in the pavilion, and I'll see what the gardener's cottage can supply us." He was back in 15 minutes, chuckling as he lugged a big hamper. "We'll have a picnic," he proposed. "Oh, let's," said Patti joyously. She did not mind eating with him in the least, for he had washed his hands and appeared quite clean. She helped him unpack the hamper and set the table in the little pavilion beside the fountain. He had lettuce sandwiches, a pat of cottage cheese, a jug of milk, orange marmalade, sugar cookies, and gingerbread hot from the oven. "What a perfectly bully spread!" she cried. He held out his hand. "Another penny." Patti peered into an empty pocket. You'll have to charge it. I've used up all my ready money." The spring sun was warm. The fountain was splashing. The wind was sprinkling the pavilion floor with white magnolia petals. Patti helped herself to marmalade, with a happy sigh of contentment. "The most fun in the world is to run away from the things you ought to do," she pronounced. He acknowledged this immoral truth with a laugh. "I suppose you ought to be working?" she asked. "There are one or two little matters that might be better for my attention." "And aren't you glad you're not doing them?" "Bully glad." She held out her hand. "Give it back." The cent returned to her pocket, and the meal progressed gaily. Patti was in an elated frame of mind, and Patti's elation was catching. Escaping from bounds, trespassing on a private estate, planting onions, and picnicking in the Italian garden with the head gardener, she had never had such a dizzying whirl of adventures. The head gardener also seemed to enjoy the sensation of offering sanctuary to a runaway schoolgirl. Their appreciation of the lark was mutual. As Patti, with painstaking honesty, was dividing the last of the gingerbread into 2 exact halves, she was startled by the sound of a footstep on the gravel path behind. And there walked into their party a groom, a crimson-faced, gaping young man who stood mechanically bobbing his head. Patti stared back a touch apprehensively. She hoped that she hadn't got her friend into trouble. It was very possibly against the rules for gardeners to entertain runaway schoolgirls in the Italian garden. The groom continued to stare and to duck his head, and her companion rose and faced him. "Well?" he inquired with a note of sharpness. "What do you want?" "Beg pardon, sir, but this telegram come, and Richard says it might be important, sir, and he says for me to find you, sir." He received the telegram, ran his eyes over it, scribbled an answer on the back with a gold pencil which he extracted from his pocket, and dismissed the man with a curt nod. The envelope had fluttered to the table and lay there face up. Patti inadvertently glanced at the address, and as the truth flashed across her, she hid her head against the back of the stone seat in a gale of laughter. Her companion looked momentarily sheepish, then he too laughed. "You have enjoyed the privilege of telling me exactly how rude you think I am. Not even the reporters always allow themselves that pleasure." "Oh, but that was before I knew you. I think now that you have perfectly beautiful manners." He bowed his thanks. "I shall endeavor to have better in the future. It will be my pleasure to put my greenhouses at the disposal of the young ladies of St. Ursula's some afternoon soon." "Really?" she smiled. "That's awfully nice of you." They repacked the hamper and divided the crumbs among the goldfish in the fountain. "And now," he inquired, "which will you visit first, the picture gallery or the orchids?" Patti emerged from the orchid house at 4:00, her arms filled with an unprecedented collection for Connie's book. The big yellow 4-in-hand coach was standing outside the stable being washed. She examined it interestedly. "Should you like to have me drive you home on that?" "Oh, I'd love it," Patti dimpled. "But I'm afraid it wouldn't be wise," she added on second thought. "No, I'm sure it wouldn't be wise." She firmly turned her back. Her eyes fell on the road, and an apprehensive light sprang to her face. "There's the hearse." "The hearse?" "Yes, the school wagonette. I think I'd better be going." He accompanied her back through the vegetable garden and the enchanted wood, and held her flowers while she crawled under the fence, tearing a hole in the other shoulder of her blouse. They shook hands through the barbed wire. "I've enjoyed both the onions and the orchids," said Patti politely, "and particularly the gingerbread. And if I ever have any convict friends in need of employment, I may send them to you?" "Do so," he urged. "I will find them a job here." She started off, then turned to wave good-bye to him. "I've had a perfectly bully time." "A penny!" he called. Patti laughed and ran. End of Chapter 10. Recording by